we've come to the end of this session, which was very interesting. Just one word before we close is that we've got very nicely, all of us, we've thought about all of this, what we need to do, and so on. I think we probably will want to challenge all of us now to think about the next step after today. What's the next step? We know what we want to do to achieve the network. What will be, if you want to start a roadmap, what will be your next step? We don't want to wait till next year for another workshop. We need to be working. So we should be thinking in our mind, and yeah, I'm sure we'll be thinking about this. What's the next step that we will do tomorrow before next year? Yeah, thanks.
Not even tomorrow, because before the end of the day, we will have at least 1 hour of discussion how we will proceed after this. It is already in the agenda, so you're not going to wait till tomorrow.
Yeah, very good. Okay, so now we will start the new sessions, panel discussions related to the legal and ethics regarding biobanks. And for this session, we have 2 distinguished panelists, Dr. Maimuna and Professor Madarina. So we kindly request to ask Dr. Maimuna and Professor Madaria to come on the stage.
It's our turn.
Yes.
So we'll sit here. No.
Okay, so.
Because I think we must go first. Yeah? Am I going? Okay.
I'm here going first because I'm in the middle.
Yeah.
Okay. It's going to be a discussion, so we don't want to spend too much time with presentation, but we want to set the scene. What I'm going to do is just give you a little bit of some of these definitions that we'll be discussing, and Rina will give you some background on what's going on in Indonesia, and the discussion will be about what do we do. And so, the next slide, please. Just to set the scene. So, when we talk about ethics and our responsibility as biobankers, it's just to look at the statement and know where our responsibility is. And so, why do we have regulation? We know now we're moving towards the age of large sequencing data, digital data, that can create a lot of difficulties for people, for the wrong people getting access to our information, our data. Not even only medical people, but it could be non-medical people. We have a problem with insurance companies, for instance, having information on certain genetic makeup of certain individuals and community, and might want to use that to for benefit of their business to increase premium, for instance. These are all the worries that people have about genetic data. And there's the issue about stigmatization, that if the community know about certain family that have certain illnesses. I came back from H3 Africa, and there was a big discussion on this issue of stigmatization. For instance, they showed a case of a family that had schizophrenia, and it became public knowledge. The community knew about it, and the stigmatization went towards negative impact. That family was isolated. Nobody in the community would want to marry anybody from that family. They had a big problem. They couldn't have wives, they couldn't have husbands, and it was a big problem. And it only happened because the community were watching these field workers and doctors coming, and they were going in and out of this family, asking them questions, taking blood sample, and they just added one and one, and they didn't get the data, but they just, it wasn't done in a discreet way. So stigmatization is a real problem. So we have to be very mindful of that, not to risk the disclosure of sensitive information. Next, please. So the issues that we need to consider when we are discussing is the issue of privacy, data sharing, informed consent model, withdrawal from research and return of findings. We will not talk so much about it. Actually, withdrawal from research, we can talk about it. I think it's important, because any research activity, any consent form should give the individuals the leeway to withdraw if they want to. But that comes with responsibility from us. We need to be able to organize our governance and our biobank in such a way that if we are contacted by a patient who doesn't want to no longer participate, we should be able to withdraw their samples. However, international guidelines says that we can withdraw samples, but samples that already have data that is part of a cohort study or a study, we cannot withdraw those data. And that's a consent, in the consent form, and they have to sign it. But we must have a procedure where it's transparent on how we deal with withdrawing the sample from. So that's important to talk about. Next slide, please. So I've just given you a slide on the documents that you can read on the internet. The first information really, or guidelines, is from the Declaration of Helsinki, which deals with protection of individual and biological resources. There's OECD, there's US NCI and ISBA. And there's the Global Alliance for Genomic and Health. What they're doing is they are developing framework for research in different regions in the world. It's a global one. Their participation from everywhere, and they're looking at different cultural differences. They come with a framework, and we need to adapt them. And this is ongoing. P3G also is another organization that has all these documents. And in Europe, they have the new regulation, the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, that at the end of the day, if it's adopted, I think next year or whatever, would be, hopefully all European countries who sign to it would agree to it. This data regulation had to come in place because of the advent of digital data. At first, when it came out, it did not protect, it did not have a caveat to exclude research. And so the Europeans, BBMRI and others, had a lot of discussion with EU. And it was really because of social media, Facebook, digital data, and all these things. They wanted to protect European, which is right, but they did not exclude research data. So digital data from research was also part of this global regulation. Now, it's becoming very clear that everyone in EU and the Commission realized that we need to exclude or have some caveat to protect so that researchers, but you can imagine if researchers do not have the right to share data, digital data for research, it means that that's end of research in Europe. So that's going to be sorted. The next slide, please. So now we talk about definitions. When we talk about ELC, informed consent, we all know what it is, but just to say, it's a decision that somebody makes to participate in research, and there should be no coercion, there should be no force, there should be no bribery when we try and get consent from individual. But important thing about informed consent, that there should be information. We should provide the patient or participant all the information they need to make up their mind. And the information should be provided in such a way that they can understand, in the language they understand, and if possible, even with visual images to show people, if it's possible, if they don't understand so much what we're saying. But the information, it's very difficult for us to say, yes, we've given informed consent, that's it. And how do you show that the individual, the participant, understands the information? It's a challenge, but we have to be always careful about that information is well understood. Next slide, please. So I like to just talk about broad consent. When we talk about biobanking, we're really talking about broad consent. And so broad consent is to collect samples and data for future use. So therefore, we cannot give them all the information because we don't know what the samples will be used for. But in the consent form, we would say that the sample will be used for future, either for genetics if we know, or whatever. But what's important is that when we talk about broad consent, we are not talking about blanket consent. And blanket consent means that there's no way that there's nothing we can do after the donation has been made to inform the individual that and not even ethics committees will be involved. So long as the patient has given us their sample and data, we researchers can use it forever. That's not what we mean. In broad consent, we must refer any new requests for research to an ethics committee, and I think you're all aware of that. And this is something we need to say to people who are worried about broad consent, that it is not that we will continue to use samples forever without having ethical approval. Next slide, please. So in biobanking, we know very well that anonymization is very important, that we do not link individuals to data and to sample. And so when we talk about anonymization, we're talking about the process that we put in place not to be able to identify the donor, and that remains anonymous. But you can imagine that in some cases, if it's a population-based study, we cannot, so the next slide, we cannot completely keep anonymization. We need to, at some point, identify individuals. If we're doing follow-ups, we need to go back to the same people, and we need to be able to keep their serial information. So sometimes it is not possible to completely throw away the anonymization, the identity, but that identity should be kept. The code should be kept by an independent body or independent committee. So when we can de-anonymize, we should have a system, the governance should have a system where we know how there will be the de-anonymization, that we will not be still in the biobank, be able to link the individuals. So research ethics committees, these are committees and group of people that formally are designated by institutions, by the region, by the government to review ethical proposal. And they are not only responsible for the ethics, they're also responsible for the financial implication also. And that's something that we don't often think about, that the financial implication of the project has to be reviewed. For instance, if the ethics committee are telling us that, I think Bert said it, if you have 2 million donors, and the ethics committee say, before you do any work on them, you need to recontact them. That's a lot of money. No scientific project will be able to do that. And I think we all believe it's the responsibility of ethics committee to think about those things. If the research is very important, and if the research is not conducted, we will be at a worse position. They need to consider whether really they should include that we recontact individuals, knowing that that study will never take place, or there should be a way to waiver it. So ethics committees have that responsibility as well. Next. And importantly, which is something that ethics committee don't think about, or we don't think about, there should be periodic review. So once we have given, and the ethics committees should have that in their approval, the researchers should come back to ethics committee and report back. We can decide how long we want that. When the project has ended, at IAC, the system we have is that the biobank has a reporting form, which we send in the consent form and the material transfer agreement. We tell them, not in the consent form, in the MTA, we tell them that we want you to report back to us on how you've used the sample, what's the status of this research. And we have a standard template, and they will fill it in. If it's going to be published, if it has published, or if they've run out of funding, we have that information. And the MTA has a limit. If you're going to continue to use the samples beyond that limit, that report back should come to us to ask for an extension. So that's also the responsibility of the ethics committee to follow that up. So we talked about material transfer agreement and data transfer agreement, and these are documents, contracts that that governs how the material, sample or data from a donor agency or institution will be used by the recipient. And it's a document, it's a contract between institutions. It is not between individuals. And this is why, where we have the issue of sample belonging to an individual, it becomes a problem. Because when we are going to develop MTA, it cannot be an individual who is developing an MTA, it's an institution, because there are liabilities in MTA. If something happens, the recipient institution does something wrong, the institution is not going to sue that individual, it's going to sue the institution. So therefore, institutions have to, in our MTA process, we have the principal investigator that signs, and then we have the director of finance that countersign it. And in any other recipient, they also have the PI who signs and the director of management or finance, because it's between institutions. The other reason why MTA is between institutions, I don't know how it happens here, but in Europe and in places where I've worked before, when researchers leave, because there's a high turnover of researchers, and they are moving to another organization, that resources that they had received through collaboration belongs to the institution. They do not take it away. They can take it away if they write to the ethics committee and their boss and the organization gives permission on the condition. We had a case at IAC where a PI left, and asked us to give him all the samples that he's been working on. We wrote to the institution that sent the samples, and the institution said, no, this transfer was between us and IAC. We cannot authorize that he takes the samples away. If IAC wants to give him, then you have to have an agreement. And this is international, this is what is recognized. That's why it's important that we get these things right. Next. So I think this is discussion point. This is the last slide, so please take over.
Thank you.